Beyond the Gates spoilers for Tuesday, August 26, 2025 teased that Samantha and Tyrell regret the moment June left. It wasn't just a quiet departure, not simply a door slamming in the night, but an emotional meltdown that shook the ground beneath them. The house, once filled with strained yet familiar voices, suddenly felt an emptiness that neither of them expected to cut so deeply. At first, both children clung to what made them feel safe, the idea that Martin and Smitty were their parents, steady and reliable, without the unpredictable storms that came with them. That decision was made in fear, rooted in the scars left by June's past actions. But regret doesn't always strike like a flash of lightning, it smolders, it becomes heavy in the chest, and Samantha in particular began to feel it almost immediately. June, for her part, understood the weight of what had happened. She had lived with her mistakes long enough to know that people remember them more clearly than they remember the good. When her children chose Martin and Smitty over her, she accepted it not with anger but with sorrow, carrying the pain quietly because she felt it was the price she owed. She convinced herself that their choice was right, that perhaps the children really were safer, happier, and stronger in the hands of the people who raised them. June thought of herself as someone who had burned too many bridges, who had taught her children to flinch instead of trust. And so she retreated, telling herself she would not stand in their way, even if her absence hollowed out a piece of her own soul. In those first days after June left, Samantha and Tyrell carried themselves with forced calm. They didn't speak of her often, as though silence itself might cement the decision they had made. But silence is a tricky thing, it makes room for the mind to wander, to question, to replay scenes in ways that words might have kept at bay. Samantha found herself staring at the torn photograph, the last image of June she had kept, now shredded in her own moment of defiance. She told herself she destroyed it because she needed to let go, because holding on to the picture meant holding on to fear. Yet the act gnawed at her. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw June's expression when the children turned away from her, not anger, not bitterness, just heartbreak. That look burrowed deep into Samantha's conscience until regret bloomed like a bruise. It was on a restless night that Samantha turned to Tyrell. The siblings had grown up relying on each other in ways only children of fractured families truly understand. They could fight with each other mercilessly, but when guilt or grief struck, they shared it like a burden split in half. Lying awake, Samantha whispered into the darkness that she couldn't stop thinking about June, that the way things ended didn't feel right. Tyrell was quiet at first, reluctant, still holding on to the image of Martin and Smitty as their anchors. But even he couldn't deny that something in him twisted when he thought of June alone. Slowly, his resistance cracked. He admitted he, too, felt uneasy, that maybe their choice hadn't been as final as they pretended it was. That night, an idea took shape between them. They couldn't undo the past, but maybe they could soften its edges. Samantha suggested they give June a new photograph, not just a picture, but a gesture of forgiveness, an invitation to belong again. It wouldn't erase the pain, but it could be a bridge towards something better. Tyrell agreed, not because he was certain of what he wanted, but because he saw in Samantha's eyes a determination that mirrored his own conflicted heart. For the first time since June's departure, hope threaded its way back into their thoughts. When Samantha brought the idea to Smitty, she braced herself for disapproval. After all, Smitty had been the one who provided steadiness when June faltered, the one who stepped in with the patience and care that kept the family from breaking entirely. But to Samantha's surprise, Smitty didn't resist. Instead, Smitty's voice carried quiet understanding, telling Samantha that acknowledging June didn't mean losing the bond they already had. Family, Smitty explained, was rarely simple, and sometimes making space for imperfection was the only way it could truly hold together. Smitty's support felt like a green light, just as Samantha began to plan how to make this reconciliation happen. Naomi delivered the kind of news that makes the stomach drop. Naomi had been in touch with June more regularly, serving as a thread between the estranged mother and her children. But now, Naomi confessed, she had lost contact. June hadn't answered calls, hadn't responded to messages, and it wasn't like her to vanish completely. The silence felt ominous, not like the quiet withdrawal of someone licking wounds, but like a void too deep to ignore. Samantha's hope started to crack into panic. She wondered if June had decided that absence was better for everyone, if she had walked away forever to keep from being a weight on her children's future. The thought pressed heavy on Samantha's chest, because for the first time she realized she didn't want June gone. She wanted her back, not as a ghost haunting the edges of memory but as a living presence in their lives. Days blurred into anxious searching. Samantha pleaded with Naomi to help find her mother, each moment without news tightening into dread. Tyrell, though quieter in his worry, carried it too, his guilt mixing with fear in ways that made him restless. They imagined June drifting somewhere out of reach, a shadow slipping further away the harder they tried to grasp her. Then, like a blow they didn't see coming, the news arrived. June had been found, but not in the way they hoped. There had been an accident. The details came in fragments: something about her collapsing, her old illness flaring when she least expected it, her body betraying her at the worst possible moment. She had been taken to a hospital, unconscious, suspended in a fragile space between recovery and loss. For Samantha, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Every regret she had buried rose like a flood: the torn photo, the harsh words, the look in June's eyes when they pushed her away. None of it could be taken back. Standing in the hospital corridor, the sterile smell sharp in her lungs, Samantha whispered prayers she hadn't said since childhood. She begged not for herself but for a second chance, for June to wake up and give them a chance to mend what had been broken. Tyrell stood beside her, silent but pale, the weight of his own guilt evident in the way his fists clenched at his sides. Samantha began to picture a different future, no the one she had stubbornly clung to before, where she erased June from their story, but one where June stood beside them, flawed and fragile but real. She imagined dinners where silence wasn't a wall but a piece, photographs where June's face wasn't torn out but framed proudly, moments where forgiveness was not just an abstract hope but a living truth. More than anything, she longed to tell June she was wanted, that despite the pain of the past, love was still possible. But as she sat in the cold chair by June's bedside, staring at the motionless figure of her mother, Samantha realized the terrifying truth: those words might never leave her lips if June never opened her eyes again. She thought back to the conversations with Tyrell, with Smitty, even with Naomi. She thought of the fractured path that led them, her anger, the misunderstandings, the fear that kept them apart. It all seemed so fragile now, so small compared to the enormity of what hung in the balance. And yet, it was precisely because it was fragile that it mattered so much. If June survived, Samantha knew she would never waste another chance. She would not let silence or fear dictate their family's story anymore. She would fight for connection, no matter how messy, no matter how imperfect, because in the end that was what love demanded. The hours stretched on, heavy and uncertain, each moment carrying the weight of what might be lost forever. Samantha leaned forward, her hand trembling as she reached for June's, hoping that somewhere, beneath the stillness, her mother could feel the touch and know she wasn't alone. The room where June lay was too quiet, filled only with the steady rhythm of machines keeping time, as if life itself had been reduced to a fragile pulse of electricity. Samantha did not leave her side, afraid that stepping away might mean missing the moment when her mother's eyes would open again. Tyrell remained close, though his way of coping was to hover in the hall, leaning against the wall with his face buried in his hands, the weight of his emotions pressing down until his body seemed smaller. Naomi visited frequently, bringing food and words of comfort, but even her presence could not pierce the fear that lingered over the family like a storm that refused to break. Days stretched into one another. Every morning Samantha walked into the hospital room with hope, and every night she left with despair gnawing at her ribs. The doctors spoke cautiously, using words that danced around certainty. They said June's condition was complicated, that her illness had taken a toll long before the accident, and that all they could do was wait. Waiting, however, was a kind of torment. It forced Samantha to sit with every memory she wished she could rewrite, every word she wished she had spoken sooner. Tyrell eventually confessed to Samantha that he was haunted by the image of their mother leaving, the moment they turned their backs on her. He said it replayed in his mind like a punishment, a reminder that the last choice they made together had been the wrong one. Samantha listened, tears gathering in her eyes, and admitted that she felt the same. They were bound by guilt now, and it tightened around them until both could barely breathe. But in that shared pain, they also found a kind of unity. For the first time in a long time, they weren't pushing each other away. They were fighting, side by side, for the chance to make things right. Smitty came to the hospital too, sitting quietly in the waiting room or stepping in to touch June's hand with tenderness. For so long, Smitty had been the steady one, the anchor when everything else shifted. Seeing June in such a fragile state reminded Smitty that even the strongest storms eventually pass, leaving behind people who must choose whether to rebuild or let the ruins remain. When Samantha told Smitty she wanted to make June part of their lives no matter what happened, Smitty didn't hesitate. Support came freely, and it was more than permission, it was encouragement. Smitty wanted them to heal, to reclaim what had been broken, because keeping walls between them had never brought peace, only distance. Naomi, however, seemed restless. She blamed herself for not noticing the signs earlier, for losing contact when June needed help the most. She told Samantha that she should have pushed harder, checked more thoroughly, not assumed silence meant healing. Naomi's regret was different from the children's. It was the regret of someone who had tried to be a bridge but feared she had failed. Samantha reassured her gently, insisting that none of them could have predicted the sudden turn. But Naomi's guilt lingered, feeding her determination to do more. She threw herself into helping, arranging schedules, keeping them all grounded when despair threatened to overtake the family. It was on a quiet evening, after days of waiting, that June stirred. The movement was small, a flutter of fingers, a shift beneath the blankets, but to Samantha it was like a thunderclap. She gasped, clutching her mother's hand tightly, whispering her name again and again as if the sound itself might anchor June back to consciousness. Slowly, painfully, June's eyes opened. They were weak, unfocused at first, but alive. Tears blurred Samantha's vision as relief surged through her, heavy and overwhelming. Tyrell rushed in, his usual calm shattered by raw emotion. He stood at the foot of the bed, unable to speak at first, until finally he whispered a trembling, "Mom." The word hung in the air, heavier than any apology they could have crafted. It was an acknowledgement, a surrender to the truth they had been running from. No matter what had happened before, she was their mother, and that bond could not be erased. June's voice was faint, fragile as glass, but she spoke. She told them she was surprised to see them there, surprised they hadn't turned away for good. There was no bitterness in her words, only a quiet resignation that came from expecting abandonment. Samantha broke down then, confessing everything: the regret over the photo, the anger that had turned into cruelty, the desperate wish for a second chance. Tyrell added his own voice, admitting he had been too afraid to let her close, too scarred by the past to risk being hurt again. Their confessions spilled out like water bursting through a dam, and in that flood, the walls they had built began to crumble. June listened, tears slipping down her cheeks. She told them she had always loved them, even when she failed to show it, even when her mistakes made her unworthy in her own eyes. She said she left because she thought it was what they needed, not because she didn't want them. The honesty in her words pierced them both, cutting through the fog of fear and regret. For the first time, they understood her choices not as rejection but as sacrifice, however misguided it might have been. The following weeks became a slow recovery, not just for June's body but for the family itself. Samantha spent nearly every day by her side, determined not to waste another moment. Though he struggled with expressing himself, instead showing care through small acts, adjusting pillows, bringing food, staying longer than he admitted he wanted to. Smitty visited too, always steady, always supportive, encouraging the children to rebuild without fear. Naomi remained close, her role as bridge evolving into something stronger, guiding them toward moments of honesty they might have avoided on their own. As June's health improved, conversations deepened. Samantha asked about the past, about the illness that had shaped so much of June's life, about the choices that pulled her away. June answered as best she could, not hiding from the darker truths. There were mistakes she could never erase, wounds she could never fully heal, but speaking them aloud made them less like monsters lurking in the shadows and more like scars that could be acknowledged without shame. Tyrell listened quietly, his silence no longer distance but reflection. For him, understanding came not in words but in the realization that his mother's flaws did not erase her love. One evening, Samantha brought a gift she had been working on since the accident, a new photograph. She had gathered recent pictures, moments of laughter with Tyrell, quiet dinners with Smitty, snapshots of Naomi's tireless presence. In the center, she left a space, now filled with a picture of June from the hospital once she was strong enough to sit up. The photo was not glamorous, her hair still thin from illness, her smile faint, but it was real. Samantha framed it carefully and handed it to June with trembling hands. June stared at the photo for a long time, her lips quivering as emotion swelled. It was not just a picture, it was proof that she belonged, that her children saw her as part of their story again. She clutched it tightly, whispering thanks through tears. For Samantha, it was the closure she had been seeking since the night she tore the old photo apart. For Tyrell, it was a symbol that their family, however imperfect, was whole again. The future remained uncertain. June's health was fragile, her illness unpredictable, and the road ahead promised challenges. But something fundamental had shifted. Where there had once been walls, now there were bridges. Where there had been silence, now there were conversations. And where there had been regret, now there was hope. Samantha no longer feared losing her mother, she feared only wasting the time they had left. Tyrell, too, carried himself with more openness, less afraid of letting love hurt him. Naomi often reminded them that healing was not a destination but a process, one they would have to walk together, step by step. Smitty, always steady, promised to stand with them through whatever storms came next. And June, fragile but resilient, promised her children she would never walk away not because she believed she was perfect, but because she finally understood that love was not about perfection. It was about staying, even when it was hard, even when it was messy, because family was worth the struggle. As the family began to shape their new reality, the shadows of the past did not vanish. They lingered, but no longer as ghosts haunting every corner. Instead, they became reminders of mistakes made, of pain endured, of love rediscovered. And in that balance between sorrow and hope, the family found strength. Samantha often looked at the framed photograph, a symbol of their journey, and felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Tyrell, too, began to smile more freely, his laughter carrying a weightless quality that had been absent for far too long. June's recovery continued slowly, but with each passing day, the bond between them grew stronger. What had once been a story of regret and abandonment transformed into one of forgiveness and resilience. And though the road ahead was uncertain, they faced it not as fractured individuals but as a family, one that had walked through heartbreak, regret, and fear, only to emerge together on the other side. As June's strength slowly returned, the atmosphere around her hospital bed shifted from tension to fragile hope. Days that once stretched endlessly with fear began to fill with quiet moments of connection. Samantha read aloud from old books they used to love as children, her voice steady even when June drifted in and out of sleep. Tyrell started bringing sketches he had drawn, simple, rough outlines at first, but filled with care. He admitted he wasn't much of an artist, but he wanted his mother to have something tangible, something that came directly from him. June accepted each offering with trembling hands, treating them as treasures rather than scraps. Smitty's presence remained constant. Sometimes it was a reassuring hand on Samantha's shoulder, sometimes a warm meal delivered when exhaustion dulled their energy. Smitty had raised them with patience, and now that same patience extended to June, not with bitterness but with understanding. There was no competition, no demand for credit, only a quiet insistence that the children deserved to embrace every part of their family. Naomi, ever the bridge, reminded them all that progress should not be rushed, that healing comes in waves, so gentle, some overwhelming but always moving forward if you allow it. June's discharge from the hospital was bittersweet. She was weaker than before, her body slower, her illness still an unspoken shadow in every doctor's warning. Yet walking out of the hospital, supported by Samantha and Tyrell on each side, felt like a victory. It was not the triumphant kind that erases pain, but the steady kind that says survival itself is worth celebrating. The world outside felt louder, brighter, more alive, as though it was welcoming her back into a story she thought had ended. Settling into a small home near Smitty's, June began to rebuild. The children visited daily, sometimes staying late into the night, sharing meals that were simple but meaningful. They laughed more often now, cautiously at first, then freely as trust grew again. For Samantha, these evenings became sacred. She knew too well how close she had come to losing them forever, and she refused to waste another moment. Tyrell, though still quieter, showed his love in steady ways, fixing things around June's house, sitting with her during long silences, listening more than he spoke. But life, as always, carried reminders of its fragility. There were days when June's illness flared, when fatigue kept her in bed and fear crept back into the children's hearts. Those days tested them, forcing them to confront the reality that time together was finite. Yet rather than letting that fear paralyze them, they used it as fuel. Every hard day became a reason to make the good ones count even more. Samantha would bring flowers to brighten June's room. Tyrell would cook, even if his meals were clumsy. Naomi would visit with stories and laughter, filling the house with warmth that made the walls feel less like barriers and more like protection. The photograph Samantha had given June became a centerpiece in her home. It hung on the wall where anyone entering would see it first. Guests who visited often paused, noticing the faces capture their siblings side by side, friends who had become family, and June herself, fragile but smiling. For June, the picture was proof that she had not been erased, that she belonged once more. For Samantha and Tyrell, it was a constant reminder of what forgiveness had given them, not perfection, but love reborn. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, June spoke softly. She said she knew her time might not be long, that illness has a way of stealing moments without warning. But she also said she was at peace, because she no longer carried the weight of being unwanted. She looked at Samantha and Tyrell, her eyes bright despite her frailty, and told them that they had given her a gift far greater than anything else, a chance to be their mother again, even if only for this season of life. Her words left the room in silence, heavy with emotion, but also with an unspoken promise that they would hold on to each other no matter what came next. Samantha reached across the table, taking her mother's hand. She promised they would not let regret rule them again, that every day from now forward would be a choice to love openly, without fear of mistakes. Tyrell nodded, adding simply that he was glad she was here, that he would never take her presence for granted again. Their words were not grand or poetic, but they carried a weight deeper than anything rehearsed could. Naomi and Smitty exchanged glances, quiet but proud. They had witnessed the fractures, the tears, the moments when it seemed the family might never find their way back to each other. Now they saw a different picture, one not free of pain, but stronger because of it. Healing was never perfect, but it was real. As weeks turned into months, the family found a rhythm. June's health still wavered, but her spirit grew lighter. Samantha thrived in her role as both caretaker and daughter, no longer weighed down by bitterness. Tyrell, though still guarded in some ways, allowed himself to be vulnerable more often, surprising Samantha with small moments of openness that revealed just how deeply he cared. And June, though she carried the marks of her past, no longer hid from them. Instead, she spoke of them honestly, teaching her children that forgiveness is not forgetting but choosing to love despite the scars. In the quiet moment sitting on the porch as the sun set, or laughing together over a clumsy meal, Samantha realized something profound. The story of their family was never about erasing mistakes or pretending wounds didn't exist. It was about choosing, again and again, to show up, to stay, even when it was hard, to rebuild, even when the pieces didn't fit perfectly, to forgive, not because the past was small, but because love was bigger. And in that choice, the ending was no longer one of regret, but of peace. Whatever time they had, however short or long, would not be wasted. They would live it together, fully, imperfectly, but with a love that had survived every gate they had been forced to cross.